A father comes home early to surprise his daughter, but when he sees the bruises on her face, everything changes. What he does next breaks every rule in the book and changes their lives forever. First, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The morning shift at Buckingham Palace had that particular weight that comes with centuries of tradition. Staff Sergeant Alistair Crewe stood motionless in his scarlet tunic, bearskin hat casting his eyes in shadow, rifle held at the precise angle, drilled into muscle memory over 15 years of service. To the tourists pressing against the iron barriers, he was exactly what they expected, a living statue, impressive and untouchable. They had no way of knowing that behind the ceremonial stillness, Alistair was counting hours until he could go home. At 36, he'd learned to hold himself like stone even when his mind wandered to smaller things, a 9-year-old girl with dark hair and Emma's laugh, homework that needed checking, time stories he'd been missing too often lately. The tourists saw pageantry, felt the ache of a father whose duty kept pulling him away from the person who mattered most. His first wife, Emma, had understood that ache. They'd married young before Afghanistan, before the scarlet uniform, when he was just another soldier trying to build something good in a world that often wasn't. She'd given him Clara, but at a cost that still woke him some nights. Childbirth complications that the doctors couldn't stop, couldn't fix, couldn't make right. Emma had lived just long enough to hold their daughter once, to whisper her name, to make him promise he'd never let Clara feel alone. For 6 years, he'd kept that promise alone. Clara had been his anchor through night feedings and first steps, through school uniforms and scraped knees, and the thousands of small moments that build a life. But loneliness is a patient enemy, and when Elaine entered their world, vibrant, eager, seemingly ready to embrace the family he'd been trying to hold together with one hand, he'd let himself believe it could work. The signs had been small at first, the way Clara grew quieter when Elaine was around, how toys slowly disappeared from common areas. The careful distance his daughter maintained from her stepmother, like a cat that's been swatted once and won't risk it again. He told himself it was adjustment, that time would smooth the rough edges. After all, Elaine had said all the right things about loving Clara like her own. But soldiers learn to trust their instincts, and lately his had been screaming. This morning was different, though. For the first time in weeks, he'd managed to secure an unexpected day of leave. Instead of the usual phone call to let them know he was coming home, he'd decided to surprise Clara. He wanted to see her face light up the way it used to when she was smaller, before duty carved chunks out of their time together. As the afternoon ceremony concluded and he finally stepped away from his post, Alistair felt something he hadn't experienced in months, pure anticipation. Tonight wouldn't be about protocol or precision. It would be about being present for the one person who'd never asked him to be anything more than her father. The soldier in him had learned to read environments for threats, to notice what didn't belong. As he folded his ceremonial uniform carefully into its case, that same instinct whispered warnings he couldn't quite name, something about the 2 quiet phone calls home. The way Clara's voice had gotten smaller lately, more careful. He told himself he was overthinking it, that tonight would be perfect. Just him and Clara, maybe takeaway pizza and one of those animated films she loved. Simple, normal, right. But 15 years of military service had taught him that sometimes the most dangerous threats came wearing familiar faces, hiding in the places that should be safest. By the time he turned his key in his own front door, he'd understand that lesson in ways no training could have prepared him for. London's evening air carried that damp chill that settles into your bones, making the streetlights blur slightly through the mist. Alistair walked down the familiar row of Victorian terraces, his steps automatically falling into the measured rhythm of a man who'd spent years on patrol. Even in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple jumper, he moved with the controlled precision that marked him as military. His house sat third from the corner, modest brick facade softened by ivy that Emma had planted when they'd first moved in. The garden gate creaked the way it always had, a sound that used to announce his homecoming to whoever was listening inside. Tonight, no small face appeared at the window, no rush of footsteps toward the door. He let himself in quietly, key turning with barely a whisper. The hallway felt wrong immediately. too quiet for a house where a 9-year-old lived. The air held a staleness that spoke of reheated meals and conversations that had gone cold. Shoes scattered by the door without the usual care Clara took with her belongings. A faint glow spilled from the kitchen, accompanied by the soft scratch of pencil on paper. Alistair set down his small duffel bag and moved toward the sound, his boots making no noise on the wooden floor. Years of ceremonial duty had taught him to move like smoke when he needed to. She was there. Clara sat hunched over the kitchen table, surrounded by scattered crayons and what looked like homework. Her dark hair, so much like Emma's it sometimes stopped his breath, fell across her face as she concentrated on something he couldn't see. The sight of her alone in the quiet kitchen, working away at some small task while the rest of the house felt empty around her, made his chest tighten with a mixture of love and guilt. She hadn't heard him. He stood in the doorway for a heartbeat longer than he should have, drinking in the sight of his daughter safe and whole. Then he cleared his throat softly. "Working hard, are we?" Clara's head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise that quickly transformed into something brighter than sunshine. "Dad!" Her voice held disbelief, as though she'd been wishing so hard for him to appear that she wasn't sure he was real. He managed a smile, warmth spreading through his chest. "Hello, love." The chair scraped back violently as she launched herself from her seat. In 3 quick strides, she was in his arms, small hands clutching his jumper like she might never let go. He lifted her easily, pressing his face to her hair and breathing in the familiar scent of school soap and pencil shavings. "I missed you," she whispered into his chest, voice muffled but fierce. "I missed you more," he replied, his own voice rougher than intended. For a perfect moment, nothing else existed. Not the empty house, not the silence that felt too heavy, not the whisper of instinct that told him something wasn't right. Just Clara in his arms, solid and warm, and his. He set her back down gently, holding her at arm's length to get a proper look at her. That's when the kitchen light caught her face at just the right angle, and his world tilted sideways. A faint discoloration marked her left cheek, the kind of bruising that starts yellow-green around the edges. Worse, when she moved to adjust her sleeves, he caught sight of dark marks around her wrist, finger-shaped bruises that formed a pattern no playground accident could explain. Alistair went very still. It was the same stillness that had served him through 15 years of military service, the ability to freeze completely while his mind processed threats and calculated responses. But this wasn't a ceremonial stance. This was the paralysis that comes when your worst fears take shape in front of your eyes. Clara noticed his expression and quickly tugged her sleeves down, her gaze darting toward the hallway, before settling back on him with the kind of careful attention he'd seen in children from war zones. Kids who'd learned to read adult faces for signs of coming storms. "I fell," she said quickly, too quickly, her small jaw set in a way that suggested she'd practiced the words. "Down the back steps. You know how clumsy I am." Alistair's training kicked in. The same skills that had kept him alive in Afghanistan now focused on reading his daughter's body language. The slight hitch in her voice, the way her eyes couldn't quite meet his, the defensive set of her shoulders. This wasn't the truth, and they both knew it. He crouched down to her level, forcing his voice to stay steady despite the cold rage beginning to build in his chest. "Clara, look at me, sweetheart." Her eyes lifted to his, and he saw everything he needed to know. Fear, hope, the desperate wish that he might be someone she could finally tell the truth. "I'm all right," she whispered, but the way she said it, rehearsed, fragile, like a prayer she'd stopped believing, told him exactly how not all right she was. Alistair swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch her face gently, carefully avoiding the bruise. The soldier in him wanted to demand answers, to interrogate until he had facts. The father in him wanted to wrap her up and never let anyone hurt her again. Instead, he pulled her close, his voice low and fierce in her ear. "No one should ever hurt you, Clara. Not ever. Do you understand me?" She didn't answer with words, but the way she clung to him, desperate, relieved, like someone who'd been drowning and finally found something solid, told him everything. From somewhere upstairs came the sound of heels on hardwood, followed by the low hum of a woman's voice. Clara stiffened in his arms, like a deer hearing gunshots. Alistair felt it immediately, the way her small body went rigid with anticipation, how her breathing changed from relieved to controlled. Elaine appeared in the kitchen doorway, and for just a fraction of a second, her face showed genuine surprise. Then the mask slipped into place, the practiced smile, the careful arrangement of features that was meant to look welcoming, but somehow felt calculated. "Well," she said lightly, though her eyes flicked to his duffel bag near the door, clearly cataloguing evidence of his unannounced arrival. "This is a surprise." Alistair straightened slowly, keeping one hand on Clara's shoulder. His voice was calm, measured, but those who knew him well would have recognized the warning in it. "I wanted to surprise my daughter." Elaine's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She leaned against the door frame with studied casualness, arms crossed in a way that was meant to look relaxed but felt defensive. "You could have called ahead. I would have made something special for dinner." Clara shrank back slightly, moving behind his leg. The movement was subtle, instinctive, but Alistair caught it the way he'd once caught the glint of sniper scopes in distant windows. "I wasn't looking for special preparations," he replied, his tone even. "I was looking for time with her." The silence that followed felt loaded, like the moment before an explosion. Elaine's smile flickered, then returned sharper around the edges. "She's been fine," Elaine said, and that tiny pause before the word fine rang like an alarm bell. "A bit accident-prone lately, but you know children, always tumbling about. She took quite a spill down the back steps last week." Alistair's eyes narrowed, but his expression remained neutral. "She's 9 years old. She shouldn't have bruises on her face." Elaine's laugh was too bright, too quick. "Oh, Alistair, children bruise if you look at them wrong. Surely you remember being young, all those scrapes and bumps from playing too rough. Clara's no different." He let the words hang in the air, watching her the way he'd once watched suspected insurgents in market crowds. Her voice was smooth enough, but her body told a different story. The way her fingers worried at her sleeves, how her eyes darted to Clara when she thought he wasn't looking. The flush creeping up her neck despite her casual tone. Clara remained silent, but her silence was deafening. Elaine pushed off from the doorframe, moving into the kitchen with the kind of forced ease that came from someone trying too hard to appear natural. "Honestly, you make it sound sinister. She's been a bit moody lately. You know how girls her age can be. Pouts when I ask her to help with chores. Throws little tantrums when she doesn't get her way." Clara's head dropped, shoulders curling inward like she was trying to make herself smaller. Alistair felt something crack inside his chest, watching his daughter absorb blame for things no child should have to carry. "Moody," he repeated quietly, letting the word sit between them like an accusation. "It's perfectly normal," Elaine continued, reaching for a glass and filling it at the sink. Her movements were too deliberate, too controlled. "Children test boundaries. They need firm guidance. Perhaps if you were here more often, you'd understand the challenges of day-to-day parenting." The criticism hit its mark, but Alistair didn't flinch. Instead, he watched Elaine's reflection in the kitchen window, noting how her hands shook slightly as she lifted the glass to her lips. "I'm here now," he said simply. Something flickered across Elaine's face, annoyance, maybe fear. She turned back to face him, and for just a moment the mask slipped completely. "Yes, well," she said, and her voice carried an edge that made Clara press closer to his leg. "Children need consistency. Not Surprise visits that disrupt routines. The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Alistair had spent years learning to read between lines, to hear what people didn't say as clearly as what they did. Right now, Elaine wasn't talking about disrupted routines. She was talking about control and how his presence threatened it. He looked down at Clara, who was studying the kitchen floor with the intense focus of someone trying to disappear. Then he looked back at Elaine, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd never needed to raise it to be obeyed. "We need to talk." The words weren't a request, but before facing Elaine, Alistair needed to understand what he was really dealing with. "Clara, love, go get ready for bed. I'll be up to say goodnight in a few minutes." Once Clara's footsteps faded upstairs, Alistair moved through the house with the methodical precision of someone conducting a search. In the sitting room, he found Clara's belongings pushed into corners, out of sight. Her favourite books stacked behind the television. A small drawing tablet wedged between sofa cushions, filled with pictures that made his blood run cold. Stick figures of a little girl cowering while a tall woman with yellow hair loomed over her, angry red scribbles for a mouth. In the kitchen bin, buried under coffee grounds and takeaway containers, he found a school newsletter with a handwritten note from Clara's teacher. "Clara seems withdrawn lately. Has there been a change at home? Please call to discuss." The note was dated 3 weeks ago. It had never been answered. The evidence painted a picture that duty and distance had hidden from him. Clara's silence during their phone calls, the way she'd stopped asking when he was coming home, how small she'd looked in the video calls, always positioned so he couldn't see much of the room behind her. His daughter had been living in fear while he stood guard over strangers. Elaine's attempt at control began unravelling the moment Clara went upstairs. She'd sent the girl to bed with a sharp instruction that brooked no argument, and Clara had obeyed with the quick, nervous compliance of someone who'd learned that resistance brought consequences. Now it was just the two of them in the sitting room, and the silence felt different, heavier, like a storm building pressure before it broke. Elaine settled into the armchair with her wine, crossing her legs with deliberate precision. "So," she said, voice bright in a way that felt forced, "what exactly did you want to discuss?" Alistair remained standing, positioning himself where he could see both her and the staircase. Old habits from compound searches. Never let anyone get behind you. Always know your exits. "How did Clara get those bruises?" "I told you." "You told me a story," he interrupted quietly. "I'm asking for the truth." Elaine's smile tightened. "The truth is that raising a child isn't as simple as you seem to think. You show up for a few hours here and there, play the doting father, then disappear for weeks. I'm here every day, dealing with the reality of a difficult child who—" "Stop!" The word cut through her explanation like a blade. "Clara isn't difficult, she's afraid." "Of what?" Elaine's voice pitched higher, defensive. "I've done nothing but try to care for her, to give her structure, discipline." "Discipline doesn't leave bruises on a child's face." The accusation hung between them, stark and unmistakable. Elaine's composure cracked, wine sloshing slightly as her hand trembled. "You don't understand," she said, and now the careful mask was slipping entirely. She doesn't make it easy. Always sulking around, reminding everyone of Emma. Do you have any idea what it's like living in a dead woman's shadow?" The mention of Emma's name hit like a physical blow. Alistair's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained dangerously calm. "My daughter is not responsible for your insecurities." "Your daughter!" Elaine spat, abandoning pretense entirely now. "That's all she'll ever be, isn't it? Not ours. Never ours. Just yours and Emma's, a living memorial to your perfect first wife." From upstairs came a soft sound, a floorboard creaking, the whisper of small feet trying to move quietly. Clara, unable to sleep, drawn by voices that had gone from discussion to something sharper. Elaine heard it too, Her head snapped toward the staircase, fury replacing calculation. "I told you to stay in bed." She rose from her chair and strode toward the stairs, her movement sharp with anger. Alistair saw what was about to happen and moved, but not quickly enough. Elaine reached Clara at the bottom of the stairs and grabbed the girl's arm, shaking her with enough force to make her cry out. "When I tell you to do something, you do it. Do you understand me?" Clara's face crumpled, fear and pain mixing in her eyes. The bruise on her wrist darkened under Elaine's grip, and Alistair saw red. Everything that followed happened in the space of a heartbeat. 15 years of military training condensed into a single moment of absolute clarity. Alistair crossed the room faster than Elaine could process, his hand clamping over hers with enough force to make her gasp and release Clara's arm. "Let her go!" His voice carried the authority of someone who'd faced down armed insurgents and never backed down. "Now!" Elaine stumbled backward, shock replacing rage on her face. Clara darted to Alistair's side, pressing herself against his leg while tears streamed down her cheeks. "You're hurting me," Elaine protested. But Alistair had already released her hand. The marks of his fingers were visible on her wrist. Ironic justice for someone who'd left similar marks on a child. "Not nearly as much as you've hurt her," he said quietly, his arm coming around Clara protectively. Elaine tried to rally, voice rising with desperation. "She provoked me. She never listens, never does what she's told. She's 9 years old." The simple statement carried more weight than a shouted accusation. In the silence that followed, Alistair pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate and calm. "What are you doing?" Elaine's voice cracked. "What I should have done the moment I saw those bruises." He began dialing, his tone matter-of-fact. "I'm reporting child abuse." "You can't!" Elaine lurched forward as if to grab the phone, then stopped when she met his eyes. "It's not. I never meant. You don't understand the pressure." The line connected. Alistair's voice was crisp, professional, the tone of someone filing an official report. "This is Staff Sergeant Alistair Crewe, Household Division. I need to report suspected child abuse at..." He rattled off his address, his service number, the relevant details with military precision. Elaine sank back into her chair, the fight going out of her like air from a punctured balloon. "You're destroying everything," she whispered. "No," Alistair replied, ending the call and looking down at Clara, who was still pressed against his side. "I'm protecting what matters." The police arrived with the quiet efficiency of professionals who'd handled this type of call before. 2 constables, 1 male, 1 female, both with the kind of calm authority that spoke of experience with domestic situations. Elaine tried to present her case, claims of misunderstanding, a difficult child, an overprotective father jumping to conclusions. But the bruises spoke louder than her explanations, and Clara's fearful silence told its own story. The female constable knelt down to Clara's level, voice gentle. "Can you tell me how you got hurt, sweetheart?" Clara looked up at her father, then back at the officer. When she spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "She gets angry when I don't do things right. She says I'm just like my mum, and that makes her mad." The constable's expression remained neutral, professional. "Can you tell me about the last time she got angry?" Clara's voice grew even smaller. "Yesterday, I spilled juice on her magazine. She grabbed my arm and shook me really hard. Said I did it on purpose because I'm jealous that Dad loves her now instead of Mummy." From across the room, Elaine's sharp intake of breath was audible. "That's not what happened. She's twisting." "Ma'am, please don't interrupt," the male constable said firmly. Clara continued, the words tumbling out now that someone was finally listening. "She locks me in my room sometimes when I cry. Says Dad doesn't want to hear about my problems when he calls. That's why I have to pretend everything's okay." The pieces clicked into place for Alistair. The carefully orchestrated phone calls, Clara's stilted responses, the way Elaine always seemed to be hovering nearby during their conversations. She'd been controlling the narrative from the beginning, The words hit Alistair like shrapnel, each one a small wound. How long had his daughter been carrying this alone? How many nights had she gone to bed afraid, waiting for him to come home and make it stop? The constables exchanged glances. This wasn't their first child abuse case, and they recognised the signs. Elaine was escorted from the house with quiet professionalism, her protests echoing into the night before being cut short by the closing of car doors. When the house fell silent again, it was a different kind of quiet. Not the oppressive silence of fear, but the settling peace that comes when a threat has been removed. The next morning brought consequences beyond their front door. Mrs. Patterson from next door appeared with a casserole and guilt written across her face. "I heard the commotion last night," she said quietly to Alistair. "I should have said something sooner. Clara's been so quiet lately, and I noticed she stopped playing in the garden. I thought it was just... well, I thought it wasn't my place." The school called within hours. Clara's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had seen the police activity and wanted to check on her student. "I've been concerned for weeks," she admitted over the phone. "Clara's work has been declining. She's stopped participating in class discussions, and there was an incident where another child accidentally bumped into her, and she flinched like she expected to be hit. I sent that note home, hoping to discuss it, but never heard back." Each revelation was another piece of evidence that Elaine had been systematically isolating Clara, cutting off potential sources of help and support. The manipulation had been thorough, calculated. Not the random cruelty of someone losing control, but the deliberate actions of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Clara sat on the sofa beside her father, her small hand clasped in his much larger one. "Will she come back?" she asked, voice small but no longer terrified. "No," Alistair said firmly. "She won't be coming back." Clara nodded, then looked up at him with eyes that held a lifetime of questions. "Are you going to send me away too?" The question nearly broke him. He pulled her into his lap, holding her close while he found the words to make a promise he knew he'd keep. "Clara, listen to me. You are my daughter. You are the most important thing in my world. I will never, ever send you away. Do you understand?" She nodded against his chest, and for the first time in months, she felt safe enough to cry, really cry, with all the relief and pain and fear she'd been holding inside. As dawn crept through the kitchen windows, painting everything in soft gold, Alistair stood at the stove making proper breakfast. Not the rushed, perfunctory meals that had become routine, but the kind of breakfast Emma used to make. Eggs scrambled just so, toast cut into triangles, orange juice in a proper glass instead of a plastic cup. Clara sat at the table in her pyjamas, hair mussed from sleep, watching him with wonder. It had been so long since someone had cooked for her with care, had taken time to make things special just because she mattered. "Extra butter on the toast?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "Yes, please," she said, and her voice held something it hadn't in months, simple happiness. He set the plate in front of her, then sat down across the table with his own breakfast. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when two people understand they're safe together. When Clara finished, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Dad, are you going to have to go back to work soon?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the uncertainty a 9-year-old could carry. Alistair set down his fork and considered his answer carefully. "I have to go back eventually," he said honestly. "But things are going to be different now. I won't leave you alone again. Not like that." Clara nodded, processing this. "Will you be in trouble for calling the police?" "No, sweetheart. I did what I was supposed to do, what any father would do." She considered this, then slipped out of her chair and came around the table to hug him. He pulled her onto his lap, resting his chin on top of her head. "I love you, Dad," she whispered. "I love you too, Clara, more than anything." Outside, London was waking up. Soon enough, he'd have to return to his post, to the ceremony and tradition and silent vigil that defined his professional life. But right now, in this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be. The most important post he'd ever held wasn't at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. It was right here, at a kitchen table with a little girl who needed to know she was safe, loved, and would never be alone again. What would you have done in Alistair's place? Would you have seen the signs sooner? Or would duty have blinded you the way it almost blinded him? How do we balance the demands of service with the needs of the people who depend on us most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and your perspective matters. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our daily uploads. Share this with someone who needs to remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on ceremonial grounds but in our own homes. Your next story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow with another powerful moment that proves love and duty sometimes demand the hardest choices of all.